पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ बहुत सारे महाज खुले, कुछ हमने खुद खोले और काफी सारे हमारे खिलाफ खोले गए। आज का महाज इलेक्शन के नाम। बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। अस्सलाम वालेकुम, मैं हूं वजाहत सईद खान। आज 17 नवंबर है और इलेक्शन सीजन हमारे ऊपर आ गया है। आज हम पाकिस्तान के दूसरे दारुल हुकूमत वॉशिंगटन की तरफ चलेंगे और देखेंगे कि उधर क्या सोचा जा रहा है, कैसे पाकिस्तान के इलेक्शंस को देखा जा रहा है। क्यों? क्योंकि जो वॉशिंगटन सोचता है वो इस्लामाबाद और रावलपिंडी में सुना जाता है। इसलिए हमें वॉशिंगटन कम अज कम हफ्ते में एक बार जाना जरूरी है और हम इस चैनल के जरिए वॉशिंगटन आपको इसलिए लेके चलते हैं क्योंकि वो है तो हमारा दूसरा कैपिटल। मगर हमें यह भी याद रखना पड़ेगा कि एक वैक्यूम में, एक खला में हमें काम नहीं करना चाहिए। दो और इलेक्शन हमारे खित्ते में हो रहे हैं, एक बांग्लादेश में जनवरी में इलेक्शन है और एक इंडिया में जिसमें कुछ महीनों बाद इलेक्शन है। अब वो इलेक्शन कैसे प्रोग्रेस कर रहे हैं, क्या कोई सिमिलैरिटीज हैं, क्या कोई डिफरेंसेस हैं, क्या हम कुछ लेसन्स लर्न कर सकते हैं उन दोनों इलेक्शन से। आपको याद रखना पड़ेगा कि पाकिस्तान की इस्टेब्लिशमेंट ने जो पिछले 1.5 साल में पाकिस्तान की अवाम के साथ, पाकिस्तान के आइन के साथ और पाकिस्तान के सिस्टम के साथ जो किया है वो उसने खला में नहीं किया। उसने बैनुल अक़वामी जो चेंजेस हो रहे हैं, जो इंटरनेशनल मोमेंटम एक बढ़ा हुआ है, दुनिया कहीं और जा रही है, उसको देखते हुए किया है। स्पेशली इंडिया के साथ जो रिलेशंस हैं उनको रिपेयर करने के लिए भी किया है। शायद इसलिए नवाज शरीफ जो प्रो इंडिया हैं, जो इंडिया के साथ तिजारत, इंडिया के साथ नॉर्मलाइजेशन वगैरह करना चाह रहे हैं, शायद इसलिए नवाज शरीफ के लिए सेहरा तैयार हो रहा है। मगर रिमेंबर, नवाज शरीफ की तो हम बात रोज ही करते हैं मगर इंडिया की बात कम करते हैं। इंडिया में इलेक्शंस तो हो ही रहे हैं, हमें पता है, और हमें यह भी पता है कि मोदी गालिबन जीतेंगे। मगर इंडिया राइज भी कर रहा है और इस सब में इंडिया कैसे डेवलप कर रहा है, इंडिया की पाकिस्तान के साथ आने वाले दिनों में और फिर आगे खुद खिते में जो दीगर और ममालिक हैं उनके साथ कैसी रिलेशनशिप है। तो आज हम एक नया, आप कह सकते हैं, पहलू आपको दिखा रहे हैं कि हम खाली अपने आप को नहीं, अपने गिरबान में तो झांकना जरूरी है, मगर साउथ एशिया को भी होलिस्टिकली आज देख रहे हैं। इन तीनों ममालिक के इलेक्शंस, पाकिस्तान, बांग्लादेश और इंडिया के इलेक्शंस, और स्पेशली इंडिया की जो राइज जिसे कहा जा रहा है उसको देखते हैं। हमारा इंटरव्यू वॉशिंगटन में अब शुरू होने वाला है। अब वॉशिंगटन की तरफ चलते हैं। इससे पहले कि मैं चलूं उधर, शेयर करें, लाइक करें, सब्सक्राइब करें, कमेंट करें। इंडिपेंडेंट मीडिया को, इंडियन मीडिया कह रहा था, इंडिपेंडेंट मीडिया को सपोर्ट करें एंड स्टे इन टच। एंड लेट्स नाउ गो टू वॉशिंगटन डीसी। All right, now it's time to go to Washington as we do every week, and it's time to reconnect with the one and only Mike Kugelman, the South Asia Institute's director at the Wilson Center, and of course, my captain when it comes to all things Washington. Mike, great to have you back.
Thank you. Good to be back with you.
All right, now we're doing what is now becoming customary, wrap up of your fantastic brief, your South Asia briefing for Foreign Policy magazine. You've got 3 or 4 stories there, but I see a pattern. I see 3 countries with elections looming in this next coming year. But your brief was pretty clear about Pakistan, and the messaging was even more stark from you. You mentioned the Bangladesh elections. You don't talk about the India elections, but we'll come to that. But for Pakistan, you said ominous signs in Pakistan. Now, with 83 days left, Mike Kugelman, what is so ominous about elections in Pakistan? For a casual observer, things seem to be back to normal. Nawaz Sharif is meeting the British High Commissioner like he's already head of state. He's got alliances in Karachi and Balochistan. Even the PTI seems to be holding its corner meetings, and it seems that Imran Khan's case is heading towards some sort of transparency in that trial. Things seem to be on the mend when it comes to the IMF as well. What's ominous? What's your problem?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that on procedural levels, things seem to be coming along well. It was a big deal when the formal election date was announced several weeks back. But my main concern, and I'm not alone in having this concern, is that the playing field, so to speak, the electoral playing field is not a level one in Pakistan. And the main reason for that is an ongoing story, which you well know. I mean, this crackdown on the PTI with its chief in jail, with so many other PTI leaders in jail or having been pressured to quit politics or join other parties. That's been ongoing. But there were two specific things that have happened over the last few weeks, which I flagged in the brief, which made me think even more that there's concerns about a non-level playing field. One was, of course, several weeks back, Fawad Chaudhry was, according to his wife, taken from his home, arrested, abducted, whatever term you want to use. And that's very striking because he is one of those political figures that had already quit PTI. And so it's very striking that this is someone that had formerly been close to Khan, but he'd formally moved away from him. He'd quit. He left PTI. He joined another party believed to be blessed by the military. So the question is, why then is he being targeted again? And that, I think, raises concerns. Then, secondly, as you know, Asad Umar was arrested some days back. And this suggests to me that there's very few, if any, senior PTI leaders on the highest level of the totem pole, so to speak, that are still out there doing things, that have not been arrested, that have not quit PTI, not quit politics. So it all suggests to me that, yes, PTI remains a very popular party. Its supporters want to vote it back into power, but it's going to be very difficult to do that if it's going to be so hard putting people on the ticket, given what's been going on.
All right. Well, given what's been going on, one quick follow-up, and we do this because you're our man in Washington. Last week when we connected, you had said that there are indications in last week's brief that the IMF is watching this space. The US is watching this space too. There is some sort of, not nervousness, but concern about whether these elections will be held, and that the Pakistani military establishment could use terrorism or the economy as a pretext to, well, delay elections. Is that still the word, or do you think things seem to be stabilizing now? We have clarity of some sort. Election meetings are happening now. Rallies are happening of some sort at some level. Alliances are being made. It seems that election season has picked up in this last week. Do you see your position changing there?
Yeah, what I said last week has not changed in my view, in that for the US, and I imagine for a number of other Western governments, there's a fairly low bar in terms of what the expectations are for an acceptable election, so to speak. One would be that the election happens. And so I think where it seems quite sure that the election will happen, though, again, I mean, that could change, can't rule it out, but the election date's been set formally. And, I think that another expectation is that the election be nonviolent, that there not be significant levels of violence. Obviously, one can't rule anything out. Hopefully, it won't be violent. But I think that these issues that we were talking about earlier, about the concerns of the lack of a level playing field and so on, I don't necessarily think that's something that that the U.S. or the IMF, for that matter, is going to be significantly concerned about. It was the issue of the uncertainty, the political uncertainty. For the IMF, that was the biggest worry. That, this sense of not knowing when the election would happen, if it would happen, that was the concern. But now that the date's been set, I think from the IMF's perspective, that's a good thing. My own view is that, at the end of the day, if Pakistan is looking to get a new deal with the IMF, and it will need a new deal, I imagine the IMF would want to formally conclude that, not with the caretaker government, but with the next elected government, whatever that looks like.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense for the IMF. I don't know if it makes sense for the voters of Pakistan to have perhaps what is perhaps the most popular political party sidelined clearly. Now, let's move to the other side of South Asia. Now, another country, formerly known as East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, is also having elections, not too far from the date where the country formerly known as West Pakistan is supposed to be having elections. Interesting story there. But in this case, the opposition doesn't want elections. The opposition wants the opposite. It wants, but yet it also wants some of the same: transparency, a level playing field. Play this out for us and tell me, as if I know nothing about South Asia, what's the differential here between the Bangladesh elections, which are scheduled for January 8th versus, or January 6th rather, versus the Pakistan elections, which are scheduled for February 8th?
Right. So, I mean, there are some notable similarities and differences between the two. The biggest similarity is that on the procedural aspects of the election appear quite sound, in the sense that Bangladesh, like Pakistan, has now announced a formal election date. Just a few days ago, Bangladesh announced the election date happening in early January. But you're right. I mean, the issue of the opposition is very striking in Bangladesh, in that at least now the position of the opposition is that it doesn't want to participate in the elections. The opposition, the Bangladesh opposition's view, and when I say opposition, I should emphasize that I'm talking specifically about the main largest opposition party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP. There are other opposition parties in Bangladesh that take a different view, but they're not as big or influential. The BNP's position is that it will not participate in any election unless the current government steps down immediately, giving way to, and this will sound familiar, right? Giving way to a caretaker administration, which would then prepare the grounds for an election. The BNP's view is that you cannot have a free and fair election in Bangladesh so long as the current government, which it views as autocratic, corrupt, and so on, is still in power. Now, the tricky thing is, Bangladesh previously had caretaker governments. It had the same mechanism that Pakistan had, as you know, where when governments were reaching their end, they'd step down, and then you have a few months of a caretaker regime that would come in and prepare the grounds for the elections. However, about a decade ago, the Bangladesh Supreme Court struck down the caretaker provision. And so there has not been a caretaker government clause. So the ruling party's view and response to that demand by the BNP would be, well, it would be illegal, it would be unconstitutional to have a caretaker government. That would be one response. But the interesting thing is that it was during the Awami League's term, the ruling party is the Awami League. It was early on in its first term when the Supreme Court struck down the caretaker administration. So they're at a loggerheads, in the sense that the BNP has claimed that unless the ruling party steps down immediately, it's not going to participate in elections. The Awami League is not going to give in to that demand. It's not going to happen. So I think now we're looking at the very real prospect of an election happening without BNP participation. They have boycotted once in the past. Now, if you were to have an election where there's no BNP, then I think that you could expect sort of Saddam Hussein-like election results, where you have 97% of the vote, 98% of the vote going to the Awami League. But if they're running against themselves, it's difficult for the BNP to try to make a case to the international community and say, well, look, the election was rigged. How could they say that when they didn't even participate? At any rate, it's a mess, much like Pakistan's election environment. But at least we do know when the election will happen.
Right. I find it supremely ironic that the two countries with a shared history but big differences which led them to split apart are sort of converging on the same structural issues, where there's a lack of trust in government institutions. But that leads us to the elephant in the room, India. Now, your briefing this week covers a couple of major deals the Indians have embarked on. We'll come to the business end first, but secondly, but let's talk about the political end first. Now, India's elections are also looming, obviously a much more complicated exercise than other elections. Huge, staggered, the world's biggest electoral enterprise. Your brief this week doesn't cover the elections, but tell me, as if I'm a 5-year-old, what's happening with the Indian elections, and how are they different from these other two elections which are happening in Bangladesh and in Pakistan, of course?
Right. So India, like Bangladesh and like Pakistan, has scheduled parliamentary elections every 5 years. So it works out that indeed India, like Bangladesh and Pakistan, have elections next year. They're going to be in the spring. As you said, it takes a long time because it's a very large country of more than a billion people. It's a very staggered process. And I have to say, I mean, say what we want about India, but I would argue that the way in which India carries out these mammoth elections is quite remarkable. And there's always there's always going to be allegations of some rigging. You do have some small scale violence that sometimes plays out in the course of these elections, but largely speaking, they're very effectively, efficiently run, and generally not violent. Speaking about recent history, and I think that's something significant. But I'll say this: there's a lot of intrigue and controversy and uncertainty swirling around the Bangladesh elections, the Pakistan elections. I would argue that there's nothing like that with India. I would argue that it would take some type of catastrophic black swan event to lead to a situation where Narendra Modi is not reelected for a third straight term. He is so popular, and the opposition in India is so divided, so fraught, and there is no figure that comes close to approximating Modi in terms of someone who has charisma, who has prominence, who's respected, who's liked. Rahul Gandhi is the closest thing you get to that, but I would argue that many Indians, including those that don't support Modi, view Gandhi as an out of touch dynast, which might have some truth to it. But at any rate, I think that we can expect Modi to be back, and I don't think that rigging concerns are going to be again, there always is going to be a bit of small scale rigging, but I have no reason to think that India's election will not be a relatively clean one. I have no reason to think that Modi will not be back for a third term in a row. We could talk in a few years about whether he'll want to come back for a fourth term. There's no term limits in India, as you know. So, he could come back and run a fourth or fifth time if he wanted to. I don't think he will, but expect him to be back.
All right. So that two quick follow-ups, which compel me to ponder over this. What's the secret sauce here for Modi? I mean, you've got some of the world's most vibrant political parties here in opposition. You've got the communists out east. You've got a lot of liberal parties in the south. You of course have the famous INC in the middle. Yet, despite of coalition building, they have this new coalition now called INDIA. Guess what that spells out? But even they haven't been able to coalesce as a coalition. Why aren't they firing? And why does Modi refuse, despite of scandals? And we'll come to the scandals in just a bit with the Adani group, which you mentioned in your brief. But why is Modi so powerful? What's the secret sauce behind his success?
Right. Yeah. Great question. In addition to all the points you made, the opposition have been able to win some key state elections over the last few years, including the Congress, which is certainly significant. So, several factors at play here. One, I would argue that the ideological components of the Modi phenomenon, Hindutva and Hindu nationalism, which he has brought out so much compared to when the BJP was in office the other time, several decades back. Modi has just made so much of Hindu nationalism, and it has a lot of traction. It has a lot of resonance in India. Not to overstate that in the sense that you have a very large Indian Muslim community of several hundred million. Many of them do not like what's happening, but the majority of the population, I would argue, buys into this ideology in a really big way. So that's been a big help, and it's further helped along by the PR machine and the social media presence that the BJP has. I would argue that many would get angry if I say this, but how could the BJP and the PTI in Pakistan have anything in common? What they do have in common is they are incredibly adept at using social media in the best possible way to appeal to youth voters, and of course youth dominate demographically in both India and Pakistan, and also they do a great job of getting the word out about what's going on with their leaders, with their top leaders. So I think that's been a big achievement for the BJP. Beyond that, I would contrast Modi with the leaders that India has had, his immediate predecessors. Manmohan Singh, who certainly was respected by many. Barack Obama famously thought him to be a wonderful individual, and he is a wonderful individual, as I understand it, as a person. But the thing is, before Modi came to power, India had been ruled by the Congress Party for a number of years, and it is perceived by many in India, and not just diehard supporters of Modi and the BJP, as a corrupt, out of touch dynastic party, which is true. And there was a lot of corruption in the Congress and during the last Congress era of government. You could talk about scandals in the Modi administration. We'll talk about Adani, but for the most part, Modi is not corrupt. He's nowhere near as corrupt as his predecessor. So that's been a big thing. Finally, I would argue that he has been able to, well, I don't want to sort of say something too political, but make India great again, so to speak, in the eyes of many within the Indian public, and that he has really taken India's profile up in a big way on the global stage. Not that India was not a rising power before Modi took office, it was, but it seems that there's been these major changes in how India has gone about its foreign policy, particularly major strengthening of relations with the West, particularly the US and the EU. Major inroads in relations with countries in the Middle East, such as Israel, among others. But I think there's a lot of pride in that Modi has been also willing to balance these long-standing partnerships with Russia and so on. And the way in which he and his government push back against criticism from the West and the U.S., that's something that's very much appreciated as well. And final point, as I said before, there's no counter to Modi in the opposition. There's no one there, and that makes a big difference.
Right. But in all of this, you do see, despite India's success story pre-Modi years, and then he's really topped it off. My God, I mean, the management of his optical enterprise is fantastic, right? In a couple of days, we're going to see India probably win the World Cup in his home ground, named after him, in his city, in his political capital, Ahmedabad. I mean, he can even, forget rigging elections. This man can probably rig a cricket match if he needs to. But,
Well,
but the issue is, and that's going to be a great coronation moment, even before his third win. But coming back, what about India's bullying? We've seen what India's done to Canada of late. We've seen how India has risen as now the clear hegemonic power in South Asia. Talk to me about the more touchy bits, for example. Where does India lie, despite of its positioning in the Quad, living in a rules-based order, being America's best friend in the global South? How does India get away with what it's been doing in Canada? And even, by the way, we reported on this a couple of days ago, even with what Indian media, forget anybody else, is now drawing its connections with India's killing spree, targeting jihadis inside Pakistan. A very disturbing story. Obviously, Pakistan's a completely different animal when it comes to dealing with India's intelligence agencies, but they've even pushed the Canadians away. How does that work?
Right, absolutely. I think that India, it gets a lot of free passes from the international community, certainly the West, but also, in the Muslim world, which is striking, given that many of the biggest concerns about India's government relate to laws and policies vis-a-vis the Indian Muslim community. It gets a lot of free passes because there is a pretty widespread view around the world that India is a critical market, that it's an important trade and investment partner. This is why you don't have, the Gulf countries, except in very rare conditions, criticizing India when you have a senior BJP leader explicitly calling for violence to be used against Muslims. So there's that, and also the strategic element. I think that I would not overstate this idea of the world rallying around the U.S. to work with it to counter China. Not at all. The U.S. has struggled to develop that type of coalition, but particularly among the Western countries, there is a general view that China's rising power is not good for the interest of the West, and that India is viewed as this critical player, so to speak, because of its size, its power, its military clout, its own competition with China. It's seen as that critical partner to enlist in efforts to counter China. So that is why. So India knows that it gets these free passes. It capitalizes on that. And you mentioned Canada. I'm sure we've talked about this crisis on your show before. That is such a great example, I think, of how India gets these free passes. Canada is, of course, a treaty ally of the United States, one of the U.S.'s closest allies, and you have Trudeau make that bombshell allegation against India In any other case, if it was made against any other country, the U.S. would be, outwardly, publicly working with Canada, condemning the country that's been accused. But the U.S. response has been very quiet. It's called on India to cooperate with Canada's investigation. At one point, you did have Jake Sullivan, I believe, say that no country. He didn't say free pass, but he basically said no country is immune to this. We're going to take this very seriously. But the U.S. has basically given an India a free pass on this as well, as I imagine other Western countries have too. And it's remarkable given that the U.S. is a Five Eyes ally of Canada. So the U.S. may well have been privy to the same intelligence that Canada does that was used to accuse India of being behind this assassination. But even with that, the U.S. has stayed quiet. But, I think that the other broader factor here is that the U.S. does not let moral considerations or values-based considerations impact its decision about who should serve as its most strategic partners, right? I mean, you look at Israel, you look at the Saudis, and we all know what Saudi Arabia has done, especially with Khashoggi. That has not impacted the U.S. desire to have strong partnerships with those countries. So we don't want to overstate the impact of morals and values in foreign policy. It comes down to cold hard interests at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, well, that seems to be the case with the last bit of your briefing, where economics is trumping, politics. This whole the enemy of my enemy is my friend, with the U.S. trying to counter the BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiative, has led to this massive deal, this multi-$100 million deal between the Adani Group, which is politically close to the BJP and Modi himself, and which is scandal prone. They've been in the news for all the wrong reasons this year, including insider trading, fudging their numbers. But yet now this group has landed a massive deal with the DFC of the US. Tell me more about this. Is this yet another case of America doubling down on one of India's biggest companies, biggest political players as well, you can say, if you can draw that line? What's happening in this? This is a very scandal-prone company, and yet they've gone ahead and they're making a port with the Americans in Sri Lanka. This is geopolitical, geoeconomic, and messy.
Yeah, indeed. And I believe this is the first time that the U.S. government has ever provided financial backing to an Adani project, so far as I know. So, the DFC, just briefly to explain, some of your listeners, viewers may not know what DFC is. A lot of Americans don't know. It's a relatively new U.S. government agency. It's the Development Finance Corporation. And it was established not long after the U.S. announced its Indo-Pacific policy. And so the DFC serves the express purpose of backing infrastructure investments with capital, with money, to push back against BRI. And, that's never stated publicly, but that's what the DFC is about. It's about providing financial support to infrastructure investments meant to counter BRI, meant to provide alternatives. So that's why the Adani port project in Colombo, I think, is a perfect target for the DFC, in the sense that, about Sri Lanka, in the sense that you have this very infamous Chinese investment in the Hambantota port, which China received a 99-year lease to administer several years back. Now, that is something that's attracted a lot of controversy in Sri Lanka and beyond, especially related to sovereignty concerns. Why should a foreign country have a 99-year lease over a port in Sri Lanka? So I think that the U.S. views this Adani port project as an opportunity to showcase an alternative, something different, where you don't have to worry about sovereignty concerns. The irony here is that some of Adani's earlier investments in Sri Lanka have provoked some concerns and controversy in Sri Lanka. But I think this port project is different. It's fairly innocuous in the sense that the idea is to build port infrastructure. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense from a U.S. strategic perspective. And obviously, Adani being one of India's most powerful people, Adani is someone who is an open secret. He's very close to Modi and the Indian government. That helps the U.S. cause as well, the U.S. strategic cause as well.
Right. And when it comes to Indian muscle, well, that's expanding and growing. They're now getting into weapons exports. Now, India is the biggest net weapons importer in the world. It has been so for the last decade and a half. But now they are also selling weapons. This is interesting. They're selling the BrahMos missile system to the Philippines, as you've pointed out. Draw this out for me. What does this mean, with that as an example? But what does this mean for Indian power in the long run, in the global south and beyond?
Right. So for many years, one of India's major military policy goals has been to strengthen its capacity to produce weaponry at home. It's long had this very troubled, inefficient, corrupt system. It's been heavily reliant on imports, and still is, as you just noted. But so many of its weapons platforms are outdated, and that includes a lot of Russian material, quite frankly. So I think that for India, it's a big achievement for it to be able to say that it's now in a position to start exporting weapons instead of only importing them. So indeed, it's a pretty small number of countries, but India has been exporting weaponry. Some of this is concerning to its Western partners, especially the fact that it sent arms to the junta in Myanmar for a number of years. And according to at least one report that came out from the UN in recent months, India has continued to supply arms to the Myanmar junta after the coup. But the Philippines is a very interesting case. The Philippines is, of course, a treaty ally. It's of the U.S. It's on the front lines of everything going on in the South China Sea with these Chinese provocations. The Philippines has territories that are impacted by Chinese provocations. So India, last year it agreed to supply these anti-ship missiles, 3 batteries of them, to the Philippines. And India and the Philippines, they have a good relationship, but it's not seen as a deep security partnership. But all of a sudden, India came out with this deal. And so the weapons are expected to come soon. Earlier, there were reports they'd come next month. It may not be quite that soon, but they're coming. And I think it's very interesting because one of the major expectations that the U.S. has of India is that it be a net security provider in the Indo-Pacific. And many critics of India and critics of U.S.-India partnership have pushed back against that, saying, well, India is not an ally of the U.S. It's not going to do that. It's a silly expectation. But look, I mean, India is now clearly in a position to be able to play that role, even if in a modest sense. And the timing is very notable. You had the Indian ambassador in the Philippines just recently say in an interview that, we're committed to this deal. The missiles are coming. China and the Philippines have been sparring a lot in the South China Sea in recent days. So I think that the timing is notable that you have that reassurance coming from the Indian government. So, this really serves U.S. interests in a big way in that it knows that India is going to be able to serve as a net security provider, at least in this very limited, specific context of helping the Philippines counter threats posed by China with these BrahMos missiles. So it's a pretty big deal. I think that for Pakistan, I think it's another, not that it needs another wake up call, but it's another wake up call that India is very much here. It's arrived as a growing power with the capacity to deploy arms to key flashpoints in ways that might not work in favor of Pakistan's interests.
Wow. Well, that was going to be my follow up, that what this means for Pakistan. But you nailed it, Mike. But onwards, to wrap things up, in terms of a modest start, in terms of this BrahMos missile system, I think this may be the same missile which strayed into Pakistani territory a few months ago. So I think they have a long way to go before they really develop that make in India defense industry worth what they're trying to brand it as. But it's a very simple question. As a Pakistani, as well as a South Asian watcher at large, is India becoming a superpower, Mike? Is that what is happening here?
I don't think so. Not yet. I do think that India is becoming. It has become a power. I would describe it as a middle power, which is a common term that one hears in Washington to refer to countries like India and many of the other BRICS countries, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt, in the Middle East, and so on. But I think that it's coming along economically, and if you look at how its economy has been able to grow and withstand the pandemic, it's in a pretty good place. But I think that one has to wait some more time. I think that its military continues to come along, but you need to see. You were talking before about its struggles to produce weaponry at home. That's something that it needs to make a lot more progress on. And given its non-aligned policy, or should I say, its strategic autonomy policy, can a country be a superpower if it embraces strategic autonomy? Right? It's an interesting question. I mean, typically superpowers they ally themselves to some degree. maybe they want to go it alone. But I think that might be a constraint for India down the road. So I think it's certainly on the path to becoming a major power and perhaps even a great power, but not a superpower. I mean, I frankly look at the U.S. and China as the two superpowers. I think that the world today is still a fairly, I mean, it's a multipolar world, but not as multipolar as many countries would like to see it. And I think even India itself would view itself as a part of this multipolar system where it could provide that function of a middle power in a world in which you have many poles of power, so to speak, which at the end of the day does neutralize U.S. power, which many critics of India have pointed out. So yeah, it's not as simple of a question as it might seem. I don't think India is a superpower yet. It might hope to be one day, though there are critics inside India that think India has no business trying to become a superpower unless it does more to address the significant levels of poverty and unemployment that the country still faces. But it's on its way. The trajectory is strong and good, but it's not there yet, and it could take some time.
Michael Kugelman of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. Mike, thanks. Fantastic. I'm glad we are making this a habit, following up on your foreign policy South Asia briefing every week. I hope you are getting ready for Thanksgiving.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I have a lot to be thankful for this year, including this opportunity to engage with you so frequently. So thank you for the opportunity.
And I haven't forgotten your promise to one day conduct an interview in Urdu, by the way. So I'm going to hold you to that. Maybe you can use the holidays to work to polish up on that bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps after I have a lot of turkey in my system, and I'll feel a bit well. Yes, let's do that. I need to be prepared. Maybe a glass of wine too.
Talk soon, Mike. You take care. Cheers.
Thank you.